For tonight's story, we're going to Allentown, Pennsylvania. And I've driven through there a couple times, and I've never felt the charm to it. There's a lot of government buildings, and there's a little bit of a meth vibe. Very industrial. It just doesn't really have the charm of a lot of cities around there. And in August of 1992, a 29-year-old, she was studying to be a nurse. Her name was Joan Burkhart. And Joan comes home to her apartment. She lives alone, and she comes in, and a fan that she had left on had been turned off, and $50 was missing, and she just felt like someone was there or in there, and so she immediately runs out and calls the police, and the police get there. They take her statement, and they write down about the burglary, and they go look for evidence, and there's not much they can do. There's no evidence. And they say, it's probably just a burglary. Don't worry about it. Lock your doors. Everything should be good. And a couple days later, one of her neighbors in the apartment complex walks by her apartment, and there's music just blaring, just cranking as loud as the speakers could play, just rattling the whole apartment complex. And the neighbor, this was strange, so the neighbor, knocks on the door, says, Joan, are you there? It wasn't like Joan to just blast music like that. Also, it's probably just annoying for the neighbor. So eventually the neighbor calls the police, and the police come and knock on the door. No one answers, and one of the windows was open, and one of the policemen gained access through the window. He crawled in, and when he crawled in, there was blood all over the walls, all over the ceiling, tracked all over the apartment on the floor. And that policeman called in a homicide, and it was the start of a nightmare time in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And it was concluded that the way that the blood was all over the ceiling, and after the autopsy, she was killed by a blunt object. They thought it may be a pipe. And the investigator said that there was a frenzy. He had a switch that flipped to have the blood splatter the way it did. It was overkill. It was just insane how nuts he went with the pipe. And a detective, it was his first murder case, gets assigned. He was working that night, and it's his case. And as you can imagine, first time case, you really want to get it solved. It's a big part of a young detective's career. And so I always put myself in the detective's shoes as well. And so he's thinking, okay, so he gets there. This is obviously not your normal, like husband freaks out and goes after the wife. This is something totally different. So they start with boyfriends, and they start with coworkers, and they start with neighbors. And Joan actually lived across the street from a state mental hospital. And after a little bit of research, she actually was dating a patient in that mental hospital. So it just was natural. It was like, all right, we got to talk to this fucking guy. So they get this guy, sit him down. I would love if they actually posted the interrogation, but it was just reported as bizarre. I mean, he's kind of a nut. So, so they're saying, where were you last night? And he was like, I was here. I was right here. I never left. And they were like, do you know what happened to Joan? You know what happened to her? He goes, yeah, sure. I know what happened to her. And they were like, yeah, sure. Who says that? But, it felt like a suspect for them. But after a little bit of digging, his story was corroborated by the mental hospital. They corroborated his iotas. And so what felt like a really positive lead, it makes sense. He's in the crazy state hospital. It's right across the street. He had the ability to leave. It goes on a dead end. And without really much, they had DNA. That's the one thing they had, but they ran it through the database and nothing came up. So it fell cold. And you can imagine living in Allentown, in the east side of Allentown, where it happened, that learning that there's a maniac with a pipe that goes into a murderous frenzy is not the most relaxing news to get. And 8 months goes by, 9 months, about a year goes by. And everybody starts to feel a little bit better. You hear about the story less and less. The sting of not getting a suspect is still there, but, it's deadened a little bit. And then about almost a year later, a 15-year-old paper girl sets out for her paper route. And her name was Charlotte Schmoyer. Poor Charlotte never delivered her papers that day, and the cops receive a call from someone in the neighborhood saying, hi, there's a paper cart, newspaper cart just sitting on the side of the road with no one, and we didn't get our papers, and our paper girl is very on time and trusty, and we're a little bit worried. And so they take it very seriously and send out police and detectives, and they combing the area, and they see a trail of blood, and they follow that trail of blood to a wooded area, and in the wooded area, under a big stack of trees that had fallen over, was Charlotte's body. And Charlotte was stabbed like 30 some times. Again, way overkill. Just someone that snaps into a murderous rage. And so now, as you can imagine, the police and the detectives know that they have a serial killer on their hands. Again, she was sexually assaulted. I don't know if I said that about Joan, but sexually assaulted, left DNA, and brutally murdered. Same with Charlotte. Same DNA. Same overkill, nutjob style. And so about at this point, 3 blocks away, the Sam Calley couple, her name was Denise Sam Calley, and her husband are on vacation. And they get home from vacation, and their house has been robbed. And a gun was stolen, and some whiskey was stolen, and they already know that the paper girl was brutally murdered, and the poor nurse was brutally murdered, and now a gun is stolen from their house. And again, they call the police. There's nothing really to go off of. They say, lock your doors. And the husband, Denise's husband, has to go on a business meeting. And he asks her, do you want to come? I got to go to this business meeting. And she goes, no, I'm going to sit this one out. I'm just going to stay home and relax. And he goes, okay. And so he leaves. And he goes and wines and dines a client. And he heads back. And when he pulls up into his house, there's ambulances and police cars and police tape. And the whole thing out in front of his house in his yard. And he parks his car and gets out and runs up. And there's a bloody sheet in the front yard. And just imagine knowing what had happened in your little town and being at a business dinner or whatever, and coming back and just seeing a blood and all of those lights pinging off your house. It just must have been a horrible feeling. But she made it. She's in the hospital. So he rushes down to the hospital, and her memory starts to come back. And what happened is she woke up in the middle of the night and felt like someone was in her house. She said, "Hello? John," that's her husband's name. She said, "John, is that you?" "John." And all of a sudden, this guy bursts into the room with a knife and just tries to... For the first time, someone got away that saw that switch that this guy flipped. He just goes into this animalistic, horrifying state. And he's trying to stab her. And Denise is one tough lady. And she's able to kick the knife out of his hand, and she runs like hell through her house out into the front yard, and she's running down the driveway, gets to the street thinking, I made it, there's no way. And then he bursts out of the house like a psycho and charges at her and tackles her right on the sidewalk in the street and just starts punching her in the face as hard as he can over and over again, and knocks her out to the point where she's half knocked out and can't really even... She was like, I don't know if he was strangling me or raping me or what. She was just half... And then luckily she either made enough noise or a neighbor turned on a light and opened the door, and the guy left. And her face, poor Denise's face, was just beat to hell, just swollen, and her eyes are black and blue. She looks like she got in a UFC fight. And it was the same thing as like a UFC fighter. Is when a UFC fighter gets knocked out bad, even when they wake up, they're talking to their coaches and friends, being like, what happened? And they're like, you got knocked out. He kicked you in the face. And they go, oh, okay. And they go, well, what are we doing? And they're like, we got to go to we're going to the hospital to make sure you're okay. And they go, okay. And then 5 minutes later, what happened? And they go, you got knocked out. He kicked you in the face. And they go, oh, okay. And then, I don't know, whatever, it's 20 minutes, half hour, an hour. All of a sudden, they like actually come into reality, and they go, wait a second, did I get knocked out? And they're like, yeah, they kicked it. And it's like, oh, man, bummer. And the coaches and stuff are like, oh, all right, he's back. And, it's crazy. And that's how Denise was, too, is she, all of a sudden at the hospital, was like everything came back to her. And so she's in the hospital for 2 weeks recovering. Rape kit comes back positive. She's there for 2 weeks and then heads back to the house. And I can't imagine going back to that house. They had installed a new alarm system. They installed new heavy-duty locks on the doors. The problem, and Denise knew it, and she would tell anyone that wanted to listen, she knew he was coming back for her. She just knew. She had seen his face clearly. He knew that. And she knew he was coming back. And 2 weeks later, so she was in the hospital for 2 weeks and has been home for 2 weeks. They go to bed, and she wakes up in the middle of a night to a sound. And think about what she's gone through. Your mind is going to wake up to sounds even if they're not there. So she tries to wake up her husband. John, do you hear that? John is stirring and kind of waking up, but not really. And then all of a sudden, the alarm system they go in starts blaring. And John, the husband, wakes up and grabs a revolver that he had on his bedside table and gets it ready and, starts walking out of the bedroom, and you can hear someone uh, run through the main room and out the back door. And he had come in through a window. And so now the detectives and the police and the Sam Cowley couple, it's not really a predator prey type situation at this point. It's just war. He has their gun. He's showing that he's coming back for Denise. And instead of just moving to a hotel or moving away, they decide to come up with a plan and fight. And the plan is, the detective sells it to his bosses that they should put one of their, best badass motherfucking cops in this house for 14 nights in a row. So right about bedtime, who they pick is a guy named Brian Lewis, and you can tell this guy just by his size that he can carry himself, and he just looks like a guy that, could save the fucking day. And and at the time, this Brian Lewis, the cop guy, he had been married for 3 months, so he has to tell his new bride, hey, that pipe-wielding, frenzy, murderer, rapist, knife freak? Yeah, they're going to put me in that lady's house for 2 weeks all night, and hopefully we're going to leave all the doors open. We're going to leave all the doors locked, and the one window that he came in open, all the lights out, and I'm going to sit in the corner. And if he comes in by myself without any backup, I'm going to try to apprehend him. So you can imagine his wife was like, no, and just not into it. And Brian starts showing up. At this point, both Denise and John get guns. And so the plan is they turn the alarm off. They lock all the doors. They leave the window open. Brian sits across the room in the living room. If for some reason he gets through him, the Sam Kellys are instructed to roll off the bed, point their guns at the door, and shoot whoever comes in. And so, it's a weird thing. It's like bedtime. You've already, gone through, Denise has already gone through hell. And a policeman gets there, hey, guys, and they lock all the doors and they go to bed. And a week goes by. Nothing. And for a job like that, that you're probably really amped the first couple nights doing it, and then as more nights go past where just nothing happens and you're tired and you're thinking, Brian was thinking, maybe he figured us out. Maybe he knows what we're doing and we're not. And it just felt like it wasn't happening, and it's getting harder and harder to stay up, and it's getting harder and harder to keep that, like, all right, tonight's the night. And on night 12, at 1:40 in the morning, Brian Lewis is sitting there, and he hears noise outside of the window. And he knew it was going down. And so his adrenaline just jacked up. And he's sitting there going, all right, here we go. And the window opens, and the screen pops off, and a giant gloved hand reaches in and grabs on the inside of the windowsill and starts pulling himself in. And the whole place is dark. And so he can't see Brian, who's right across the living room as him. And Brian is just sitting there with his heart pounding. And the guy pulls himself into the window, and the light of the moon, Brian can see his face clearly. and he takes a couple steps into the room, and Brian turns on his bright flashlight and points a gun and says, "Police." And at that moment, the guy pulls out his gun, and Brian fires, and he fires, and they both fire again, and Brian, or the guy, dives into the kitchen. And so the Sam Callies wake up in the middle of the night on the 12th night to a gunfight in their house. And they can tell it's a gunfight because the guns sound very different. It's a real low sound, pop, 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 and then a real high sound, ka, 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 ka. And it's just a full-on. And Brian's still in the family room, and the guy is still in the kitchen, and they're going back, they're trading fire. And Brian runs out of bullets, and he has 6 more, but it's a revolver, so he needs time to reload. And so he's in there, he's in the living room, he knows that guy has a gun, and also just is a total freak show, probably has a pipe and a knife and God knows what. And he is basically bluffing and pretending he still has bullets in his gun while simultaneously saying, "Shots fired, I need backup, shots fired," trying to get help. You know, he's in this, and the Sam Kellys are off their bed with the guns pointed at the door, probably just shaking. And then all of a sudden, the whole house just starts shaking, and like an animal in a cage, I think Brian said, like a rat in a cage. One time I saw a badger that was in a cage, and it just was flipping out, and it was so violent and horrible. And the whole house is shaking, and he doesn't know what's going on. He's kind of just, waiting for backup, not knowing what the hell is going on, and then all of a sudden, silence. And he goes into the kitchen, and the guy had ripped the whole kitchen window off the whole fucking wall thing and climbed out and ran away. And there was blood everywhere and glass everywhere. And Brian, even though he's had a act of bravery that a lot of us will never match, he felt like a failure. The guy was gone, nothing. They didn't get him. And because of all the blood and the lacerations, they made sure to put out a call to all the hospitals saying, if anybody comes in with a gunshot wound or anything consistent with crawling out a broken window, let us know. And 2 hours later, to everybody's everybody, just made everybody feel so much better. A guy came into the hospital with a gunshot wound and lacerations all over his arms and legs, and they got him. And Brian rushed down to the hospital and ID'd him and said, "Yep, that's him." And it was over. And the surprising thing about it is he was an 18-year-old kid. And when the first murder happened, he was actually even 17. And he had a girlfriend, and he seemed to have a pretty decent life. And he just was a psychotic predator. And he was sentenced to death after a 4-week trial. And just like that, Allentown, Pennsylvania had their town back. Happy Halloween, everybody.